Alright, this is the review for the Unit 8 test. This includes East Asia and South Asia. This test is probably one of the harder ones we've taken. It may even be the hardest. So I'll go over a little bit more detail on this review. So starting out, looking at India, we talked about obviously their high population and what that does to their economy. It's obviously going to hinder it to a point because it's hard to obviously provide for that many people, like food and things like that, and jobs. So your standard of living in India has not increased dramatically because of that. So there are a small group, 10 or 20% that are doing much better, but the majority are still in poverty. And then Japan, you need to know why they rely on trade so much to maintain their standard of living and their economy. And of course that has to do with the fact that they're an island, and they're an island with very few natural resources. So to get the resources they need, they must trade with others. So that's what they rely on to survive. Unlike England, where England's an island too, but their island has more resources on it, so they didn't have to rely on trade as much compared to Japan, because Japan has all those mountains and not much to it. Make sure you remember what terraced farming is and what that looks like. That's where you farm on the mountainside and you cut into the side of the mountain and make basically stair steps going up along the side. You know about outsourcing. Since global trade has increased quite a bit since the 1990s, so is outsourcing, and that's when we take some of our service industry jobs and we outsource them to other countries. So instead of hiring an American to do a job, we'll ship it out to India and we have an Indian do the job for us. And the biggest reason why we do this, and you have to know this, is for lower wages. It's cheaper to hire somebody in India to do the exact same job that an American could do, but the issue comes down to just cost. The company could save more money by hiring the Indian because they can pay them less. Alright, Tiananmen Square. We talked about Tiananmen Square in 1989 in China as the youth protest for more democracy in China. We talked about how the tanks came in, literally squished people with the tanks. And that, of course, was an example of how China, being a totalitarian government, doesn't allow protest or free speech of any sort. And it's not that they just don't allow it and you get arrested a little bit. They'll come in with military force and kill people over it and make sure you don't do it again. So they use strong force. And then, of course, remember what GDP is. We've gone over that thousands of times, so you should know. But along with that, make sure you know your different levels of economic activity, which again shows up on pretty much every test. So primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And of course, know how that would affect GDP. If your country was mainly at the primary and secondary levels of economic activity, would that mean would you have a lower GDP or a higher GDP? And so be able to look at that and figure out, if a country has more tertiary or quaternary, is that going to be higher or lower? Which country is going to be richer? And then China and their population growth. Of course, you know about the one-child policy that China, to try to curb their growth, has limited the size of families in China to try to slow down the growth in their country. And then North and South Korea, just keep in mind, obviously North Korea is the one that's under a totalitarian government, communist government. They have basically no freedoms and also very little natural resources. They don't trade with anybody. They also have a huge lack in infrastructure, so things like electricity and stuff like that are not very common. Alright, you need to know what Japan, Egypt, and Great Britain have in common, and the main thing they have in common is access to seaways for trade. So obviously the British, they're on an island, so they can easily trade by sea. Egypt has the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the Red Sea, which gives them access to the Indian Ocean. Of course, Japan's an island, so they have access to all of East and South Asia and the Americas. Alright, you know the climate regions throughout, especially the southern part of monsoon Asia, or southern Asia, which is going to be tropical because that's near your tropics of Capricorn, and actually Tropic Cancer, not Capricorn, and near the equator. All right, remember population pyramids. It's going to be another one of those, and how to read those. And then remember what cultural diffusion is. That's the spread of ideas from one area to another. So that could be religion, or the way you dress, or something, language. Any of those will start in one place and they'll spread other areas. There'll be a map on the test that has a question about that. Alright, you need to know why it is that in China their GDP in different regions grows at different rates. So one region will be far behind another region in China, and that really has to do with the fact that most of the money, most of your business is made on the east coast of China for access to foreign investments and also trade with foreign countries. And so that's where you see a lot more investment and a lot more business taking place is along that east coast. And so as you move inland within China, it turns more agricultural, so GDP is lower in those regions because they lack access to the sea and therefore to trade. And you know what North Africa and Indonesia have in common, and the main thing they have in common is religion. Majority Muslims. So that's the main thing that they have in common. Another one about North Korea. Actually, there's two. There's a chart about North Korea, and then there's also a political cartoon about North Korea and the UN. The UN has repeatedly put sanctions on North Korea, tried to force them to limit their nuclear program, which really North Korea doesn't listen. They just kind of do what they want. So the UN really has very little control over that situation. A lot like a parent that doesn't have control of their kid. You've seen the kids screaming in the store and the parents can't do anything to stop them. That's pretty much like UN in North Korea. Alright, and then there's some vignettes that you have to read from different speakers. And I'll read through them real quick just to make sure you kind of know what they're talking about and understand the words they're using. So you got one that says, this is talking about the economic tigers that we talked about in East Asia. It says the East Asian economic miracle was a signal that the historic domination of the world economy by Western nations was over. The efficiency and rapid growth of the Asian economies, built in part on government intervention, showed that the old model of free market Western capitalism was finished. So that person was saying that this new model, the economic miracle in Asia, is the new model of economic development, and that our model of capitalism and free market is dying and fading away, and therefore that's why East Asian countries are going to become more dominant and will become weaker over time. And next one says, despite the previous success of the East Asian economies, the recession of the 1990s was a sign of fundamental flaws in the Asian economic model. State support for big business in Japan, Korea, and Thailand and other Asian countries was not enough to sustain growth or compensate for mismanagement in the private sector. So this person's saying that this economic miracle wasn't really a miracle, that it had fundamental flaws, which means that the way it's built was fundamentally flawed, meaning that it cannot sustain itself. It will fall apart. It was set up to fail, is what that means. And they believe the reason has to do with big government, or government coming in and supporting these businesses, and not letting the private sector to really do its job, to give them more freedom. So they believe there's too much government intervention going on there. Next one, although the financial crisis of the 1990s sent Asian economies into a tailspin, the continuing growth of the global economy is likely to restore economic health to the nations of East Asia. A combination of factors, including an efficient, dynamic business sector, low-cost labor, and government support, is likely to return to the Asian tigers to the leading ranks of the world's economic power. So they believe, this speaker believes that they're going to rebound, and it has to do with the main things: the efficient, dynamic business sector, low-cost labor. That's huge. That means they don't have to pay their employees that much, and government support. So they believe those things that they originally built upon, even though they had a recession in the 1990s, is going to help them rebound from that recession and that huge hit they took. And remember, a recession is a downturn in the economy, just like we had in 2008 and continuing on, whereas now we're supposedly getting out of it. But that's when you see, of course, large unemployment rates, things of that sort, and a decrease in consumer confidence. All right, last speaker, the so-called so-called Asian economic miracle was a myth built upon the shaky foundations of cheap resources, low wages, and easy international credit. The fact that Asian economies grew under such conditions is no surprise, nor is it a surprise that they collapsed like a deck of cards. when investor confidence began to waver. So this person's saying that it's not really a miracle. That he's basically saying any economy would flourish under those kind of conditions. That's just common sense. I mean, you're looking at low wages, like the other person mentioned, easy international credit. Basically, it's easy to trade, no tariffs, that kind of thing, and very cheap resources. So these things help to grow there initially, but it won't sustain it for a long time. And that's why he said it collapsed, because it can build it for the short term, but that's nothing that you can build a sustainable economy for the long term on, that eventually that's going to fall apart. So he's saying really it was just a myth. It wasn't really a miracle. It was set up to succeed at first. All right, moving on. Again, more maps. It's going to be looking at the type of geography and like physical geography and climate regions and why people live where they live based on those things. When you look at it, obviously people are going to live in areas that are warmer, where you can farm more. It's lush, that kind of thing. Stay away from arid areas, mountainous regions, things of that sort. And then there'll be a question about the Three Gorges Dam. Again, that's a little vignette. That one's easy to understand though, so I won't read over it. And then more about population growth, what kind of impact it has on the economies. One thing to know is that we talked about how high population can hinder an economy, because it's so hard to support obviously that many people, and especially when you have a large aging population, the youth have to take care of them when they get jobs, and now you're seeing less young people because of controls like in China to curb growth, and so it does put more stress on the economy to support them. But also on the flip side, we see countries like Italy and Germany and stuff like that are having negative growth. Literally, they're shrinking, and it's the same thing. You don't have enough young people going into business, getting jobs and building the economy up. So also those economies shrink as well and are getting hit hard because there's not enough economic growth because of the lack of population. So it hurts when you have too many people. Also hurts when you don't have enough people. So there has to be a balance. Then about the partition of India. The partition of India, that's when they created India and Pakistan. Pakistan for the Muslims, India for the Hindus. And then they had to migrate and cross each other when they did that. And of course that resulted in the death of about 1 million people from fighting. But you saw a huge amount of Hindus that had to leave Pakistan into India. And that's the same map question on that. And then of course we talked about how East Asia is along the Ring of Fire. So you got a lot of tectonic plate activity, and so you see earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. Why there's varied climate throughout this region of Asia has to do with two main things that contributed in this region are latitude and elevation. So for north or south you are the equator, and then of course elevation, as there are many mountains. And then of course we talked about a little bit already how mountains affect settlement patterns, where people live. And so people tend to live, in valleys or along the coastline, obviously for access to trade. And then you need to know India's comparative advantage for jobs. Basically what that means, like when you take India and the other countries in that region, what advantage is it that they have that those other countries don't have? And so India's main advantage for attracting jobs is the fact that they speak English. And so the United States does a lot more business with India because of that, because you don't have to worry about translating. We can just talk to them. So that's why a lot of jobs are outsourced to India and not China or other countries in South Asia or East Asia. So that's their comparative advantage, is the ability to speak English. All right, this is going to be a two-part video actually, so because I'm nearing the limit right now. So I'll stop this one, continue with part 2. There's not that much left, so the next one will be pretty short.